Hello, my name's Amy Filiatreau. I'm going to be talking to you today about women's suffrage propaganda and the themes of agitation and control that we have learned throughout this class. If you remember from week 3's reading from Bowers et al., Rhetoric of Agitation and Control, agitators, in this case, women's pro-suffrage advocates, are typically people outside the establishment who demand social change but cannot achieve their goals through normal channels. Control is the establishment's response to that agitation, in this case embodied by the anti-suffrage movement. Agitation and control both commonly move through a sequence of cumulative strategies listed here. The agitators start with petitions and requests for change and gradually escalate their actions through the steps listed on the left. In response, the establishment attempts to quash the movement through the steps listed on the right. The women's suffrage movement began in the mid-19th century with a series of petitions and declarations arguing for universal suffrage to give women the right to vote. This represented the petition stage of agitation and control, and predictably, the establishment ignored and avoided the issue for many decades. When petitioning and lobbying were shown to be ineffective to provide change, suffragettes moved to promulgate and solidify their objectives. Through a number of public campaigns, they used a variety of tactics: pageants, parades, street speaking, civil disobedience, and publicity stunts. For the purpose of this project, I'm going to focus specifically on the imagery used by both sides in the stages of moving between the tactics of agitation and control. While in the article we read for this class focused on gender in this kind of imagery, instead, I am going to focus on the elements of agitation and control and the ways these images embodied such elements. As suffragettes moved to solidify their movement, they first began using images of idols. Women in these cartoons and postcards are portrayed as goddesses, warriors, Mary figures, and Lady Justice. Women in this kind of imagery are shown as larger than life, as in the example on the left, as the goddess figure dwarfs the people around her, and are extremely strong and commanding figures. They look nothing like a typical woman on the street. The goal here was to convince women to join this fight by showing that it was indeed a just battle, comparable to similar crucial battles throughout history and myth. The figure of woman is idealized and beyond reproach. The idealized figure would also have been considered easier to accept, easier to comprehend and support, as opposed to images of true, real women. Suffrage advocates also used images of children to emphasize their point and bring people to their side. Portrayals of children arguing for the vote do two things. They emphasize the crucial role of mother that women embody, and they also make the suffragettes seem less strident, less angry, and less threatening than some of the suffrage advocates were perceived. Plus, as with the previous slide with its idealized imagery, these images avoid being too in your face. You have a sassy young lady delivering the message, so it is less likely to put people on the defensive than images of real women. Finally, though, the imagery began to include portrayals of real women. Note here there are two very different personas. In the top left image and the one on the right, these are beautiful young women looking off to the side as if looking to a future they wish to attain. They are peaceful and wan, their heads tilted as though to show how weary they are of their struggle. In the bottom left image, on the other hand, the woman looks directly at the viewer, determined and forceful, as she pushes the women's suffrage rock up the hill to Parliament. The caption below says, "It is no good talking to me about Sisyphus. He was only a man," calling to mind the myth of Sisyphus, endlessly pushing the rock up the hill only to have it tumble back down again. The first persona is meant to proclaim the quiet sadness of women who don't have the right to vote and deserve to have it, while the second, the determined woman, is meant to convince the establishment that women's suffrage is inevitable. The tactic of using real women in suffrage imagery was to mimic what was happening on the ground. Women were increasingly picketing, protesting, and gathering in greater numbers. Soon, women's suffrage became a polarized movement. Groups on both sides became more vocal, more solidified. Suffrage and anti-suffrage newspapers and broadsides were common. As seen here, fascinatingly, the different sides adopted very similar structures and language to illustrate their different positions. Now we'll look at the other side, how anti-suffrage advocates attempted to control and quash the agitation through imagery. We already saw in the article we read in week 6 how anti-suffrage cartoons portrayed men as emasculated by giving women the vote. Images showed gender norms completely destabilized by voting women. Men were taking care of the children, and women were being sexually aggressive. These were effective means of convincing men that women's suffrage was an embarrassing and frightening threat to their masculinity. There are many such examples. But there were other themes as well. One theme was to explicitly make fun of women's intelligence in order to demonstrate how utterly preposterous it would be to give them the vote. Here we see 3 images to show this. On the left, we see the contents of a woman's mind: puppies, babies, wedding rings, young men, dresses, and hats. In the top right, women are portrayed as so undependable and silly that they would leave their own dog behind. And on the bottom right, a woman voter is portrayed as a crude savage with no teeth, and this seems clearly to have a racial element. These images were all used to denigrate women as inferior, comical, and undeserving of the vote. They are a clear contraposition to the images of women as gods and idols that we saw in the pro-suffrage images. The images get more violent and physical. Here we see suffragettes locked up and clamped down, literally incapable of speech. Here the establishment moves beyond making fun of women to a position of violence. Women's suffrage advocates are to see this as a threat, as indeed it was. And now, finally, at this point, we've moved beyond clamping down and closing women's mouths. We now have images of women experiencing actual violence. The woman on the left has been punched because she refused to hold her jaw, and her punishers claim they are glad about it. The woman on the right is being manhandled by police, the subtext being that she requires force and violence to stop her willfulness. These last 3 images portray force-feeding women's suffragettes in jail. Another example showing violence and control on the part of the establishment. These past 2 slides are portraying in cartoon form what actually was happening to women at the time. Women were being arrested and violently beaten. When women began hunger strikes, they were often violently force-fed by their jailers. This force-feeding was described as torture. Tubes are violently shoved up noses and down throats, leading to internal bleeding and abrasions. In the same way that pro-suffrage images got more real and realistic as time went on, so did the anti-suffrage imagery. During the women's suffrage movement, on both the pro and suffrage side, the imagery varied quite a bit depending on the symbols and the stages of agitation and control. The images used by both sides gradually became more real as the stakes got higher. They grew more realistic as the movements escalated. And these are my references. I thank you for your attention. I apologize for the strain in my throat. I have the flu at the moment, so it is difficult for me to talk. But thank you for your attention. I look forward to your responses.